It's a huge honour. Anybody who's a fan of Tim Harford, which I imagine is pretty much everybody in the room, in writing The Undercover Economist and his books, he strikes me as the absolutely sane end of economics, where he has a complete and proper appreciation for its value as a discipline, as a way of looking at the world, without becoming deranged or ideological. He's also, one of the most spectacularly good and fluent and brilliant writers on this subject you'll ever have. How many of you read some of Tim's books, just for interest? That is good. That's an impressive show of hands. So, huge honour to welcome Tim on board. And I think it's the importance of mess. If I'm right, Tim?
You're right.
This is going to be fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure as ever.
Late in January 1975, a 17-year-old German girl named Vera Brandes walked out onto the stage of the Cologne Opera House. This is a huge auditorium, 1,400 seats. At that moment, it was actually empty. The whole area was lit only by the dim green glow of the emergency exit signs. But still, this was the most exciting day of young Vera's life. So she's the youngest concert promoter in Germany, and she has managed to persuade the great Cologne Opera House itself to invite an American musician, the pianist Keith Jarrett, to play a late-night concert of improvised jazz. In just a few hours, this auditorium will be packed, sell-out crowd, and Keith Jarrett is going to walk out onto the stage, he's going to sit down at the piano, and without any sheet music, without any rehearsal, he is going to begin to play. Well, the reason Vera was on the stage was that she was introducing Keith to the piano in question. And the meeting wasn't going that well. So Keith played a few notes and wandered suspiciously around the instrument. And then Jarrett's producer, Manfred Eicher, he played a few notes and he wandered around, and the two of them muttered together. And then Manfred Eicher came over to Vera Brandes and said, if you can't get a new piano, Keith can't play. There'd been a mix-up. The Opera House had brought the wrong piano. So Jarrett had requested this great Bösendorfer. The Opera House had supplied this rehearsal model. So this is like, Vera said, it was a tiny piano, it was like half a piano. Jarrett later said it was like someone had sawn a piano in half and filled it full of nails. So it was the treble, the felt had all worn away. So it was this very harsh, plinky, tinny noise. And the black keys were all sticking and the white keys were all out of tune and the pedals didn't work. And the most important thing was it just wasn't big enough. It wasn't big enough, which meant it wasn't loud enough, which meant there was just no way that Jarrett could actually play this thing and be heard at the back of the Cologne Concert Hall. So it was unplayable. And Jarrett left. He walked out to sit in his car. And of course, Vera is now, this is supposed to be the best day of her life. She is about to be completely humiliated. And she tries to get a replacement piano. It quickly becomes apparent that there is no replacement available. They're just going to have to make do with what they've got. She gets a piano tuner who starts doing all the basics, but fundamentally, the piano's crap. And she's got no alternative. She goes out to Keith Jarrett, and it's raining hard in Cologne that afternoon. And she stands there outside his car, talking to him through the windscreen. And she's begging him not to cancel. And Keith Jarrett looks out at this bedraggled, rain-drenched, 17-year-old German kid, and he feels sorry for her. And he says, never forget, only for you. And so a few hours later, it's 11 p.m., Jarrett walks out on the stage. He sits down at the unplayable piano, and he begins. We're going to try and begin. And it becomes clear within a few moments that there is something magical happening. That first peal, by the way, that was a joke. That was Keith Jarrett mimicking the chimes that announced that the performance was about to begin and everyone had to come and take their seats. But what Jarrett was doing was he was avoiding those tinny upper notes. They sounded so bad. And that meant that he was in the middle range of the piano. And that meant that there was a sort of soothing ambient quality to what he was doing. But he couldn't just drop anchor in that really comfortable musical harbour because it wasn't loud enough. You couldn't be heard. And so he did two other things. One was to set up these rumbling riffs in the bass, try and get some resonance going, even with this small piano. And the other was just, he stood up and he was pounding down on the piano to try to get enough volume, to try to get this dynamic range. So you have this music that's in some ways very peaceful, and in other ways it's got a tremendous amount of energy and movement. And it wasn't the piece of music that Keith Jarrett ever thought he'd end up playing. It wasn't his plan to play anything like that. But the audience loved it. And audiences continue to love it because the Cologne concert was recorded, and the album of that recording is the most successful piano album in history and the most successful solo jazz album in history. Keith Jarrett was handed this mess, and he embraced it, and he soared. But I want you to think for a moment about Keith Jarrett's response. So he's shown this piano. He does not say, "What a fascinating creative opportunity." Come to think of it, if I move to the middle range of the piano and if I really give it some welly and then if I do it could sound pretty good, actually. In fact, I could have done that on any piano. I just, it hadn't occurred to me. But now I see. Of course he didn't think that. His response was, "I don't want to play." Of course his response was, "I don't want to play." And to be honest, even when he began to play, he didn't want to play. He just felt guilty because this girl was going to be humiliated if he didn't play, so he played. And think about our own reactions to similar situations. Well, actually, I doubt that any of us have had exactly that situation, but the situation of being asked to do a difficult job in circumstances, maybe in an office space, or with a tool, or with a teammate, or with a teammate who is a tool, or whatever, just to cope with these difficult situations, these interruptions, these obstacles, unnecessary obstacles. Our response would be the same as his: "I don't want to do it." And yet, his response was wrong. Those constraints inspired him to produce the performance of a lifetime. So I want to talk today about why that might be, and I also want to encourage all of you to, whatever the reason, however you manage to get yourself to do it, to embrace the unplayable piano in your life. So first of all, why do these frustrations, why do these obstacles sometimes help us do a better job? A whole bunch of reasons. I'm going to give you some examples from cognitive psychology, from computational algorithms, from social psychology, and from rock and roll. And I think by the time I finish that, we'll have figured out how the problem space actually works. So cognitive psychology first. So it turns out that distractions can help. So let me give you a very simple example. There was a study done by a team of psychologists, including Daniel Oppenheimer. And they teamed up with high school teachers who had multiple classes, chemistry class or an English literature class or whatever. And they said, "Okay, we'll just give us your handouts, and we're going to reformat the handouts. And to half of your classes, we want you to give the standard handout formatted in the standard font, Times New Roman or Arial or whatever. And the other half of the classes, they're going to get the same handout, the same content, but a different font. The font is going to be, so his Arial, font's going to be Arial for one class. For the other class, we might have kind of the compact Germanic punch of Hattenschweiler. Or maybe the zesty bounce of Comic Sans italicized, or maybe something sort of cursive, a monotype cursive or something like that. And these are they're just difficult fonts to read. It is not easy to read page after page of text in Comic Sans italicized, or Hattenschweiler, or monotype cursiva. It's a lot easier in Arial or Times New Roman. So you would think it was a disadvantage to be given the difficult fonts. It's not. So when they gave the students tests at the end of the semester, the students who had been given the handouts written in difficult fonts, those students did better. And this is called the Disfluency Effect. And what's basically happening is you can't just let your eyes sort of gloss over what you're reading and assume that you've understood it. You have to work. Because you have to work, you're having to make extra connections, reflect, think, just slow down a bit. So disfluency, that sort of obstacle, can actually lead to more learning. The same is true of distractions in other ways. So the Harvard psychologist Shelley Carson has been subjecting Harvard undergraduates, obviously the most studied population on the planet, to tests of their, what's called their latent inhibition. So basically, it's attentional filters. So you're trying to do some work, and then there's some drilling going on. Can you just filter out the drilling after a while? Because it's a familiar sound. Can you just block it out? You're in a restaurant. You're trying to have a conversation with somebody. There's another conversation going on in the restaurant. Can you block out that conversation and focus on the conversation you want to have? Can you do work with the television going on somewhere in the room? That sort of thing. If you can do that, you've got strong attentional filters. You've got high latent inhibition. If you can't, then you have porous filters. Now, you would think, surely, that the porous attentional filters are a disadvantage. Well, they may be, but not for Harvard undergraduates. So this is a population, clearly, who have already managed to figure out how to succeed in life. And for them, the ones with the porous filters were actually vastly more likely to have some serious creative achievement to their name. So they were more likely, for example, to have published a novel, to have written a play, to have an album out. And these are kids, they're 20 years old, 22 years old, and they've published their first novel, and yet somehow they can't tune out the television in the corner of the room. And Shelley Carson thinks there's a connection there. There are similar findings of people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So these distractions, the fact that you can't filter out the world, in some way helps you to be more creative. You think outside the box because your box is actually full of holes. So that's the idea from cognitive psychology, that some kind of interruption, some kind of difficulty, some kind of disfluency might somehow lead to some extra creative connection sparking, or just help you learn better. What about moving away from the realm of psychology completely? Let's talk about algorithms. Let's talk about computational problems. So here's a classic computational problem. You have to lay out the structure of a computer chip. So you've got a logical plan for this computer chip. You know where all the logic gates are going to be, where how all the components are going to be wires to all the other components. But you don't know physically how they're going to be laid out on the chip. Because actually there are lots and lots of different ways of laying out components on a chip that have the same logical structure. But some of them are very inefficient. They use up a lot of silicon. And some of them are highly efficient. So how do you solve the problem? Well, it turns out you're searching in an enormous search space. There are just it's not infinite, but there are an enormous number of different possibilities. So this is a bit like trying to find the right number on a combination lock. The difference is, with the number on the combination lock, imagine you try numbers on a combination lock at random, and you're told how close you are. Well, that's pretty good. That's not so good. And there are prizes for nearly getting it. So you don't have to actually get the combination. You just need to get quite good. So that's the situation you got with the computer chip. Somewhere there is the absolute optimal way to lay out this chip, but you don't need to find the optimal way to lay out the chip. You just need to find a good way to lay out the chip. But that is not easy. There are so many different possibilities, so many different ways to do it. So you need some kind of algorithm that's going to search the space of possibilities for you. So what would this algorithm look like? Well, one would be completely random. Just try a combination, try another combination, try a third combination, see how it goes. Now, it won't surprise you to know that this doesn't work very well. You need an awful lot of time with such a big search space. or maybe an awful lot of good possibilities for random search to work. Another possibility is just to look for marginal gains. So this is great. If you are an Olympic cyclist, marginal gains really works. But that is partly because the space of solutions allowed to Olympic cyclists is very, very narrow. You know, should I blood dope? No, turns out they banned that. Should I be like Graham Obery and redesign my bike? No, turns out they banned that. It's actually anything interesting is banned. So the search space is very, very well defined. So you're just constantly looking for tiny, tiny improvements. And the general way you do marginal gains is test two possibilities, one of which might be the status quo. And you say the status quo and something else. Is the something else better than the status quo? If so, do the something else. And then just keep varying, keep looking for small changes, and you just incrementally improve and improve and improve and improve. And this is a very powerful way to solve problems. It's not a great way to find a good way to lay out chips, to lay out components on this computer chip. Because what will happen is that you will quickly disappear down a dead end. So there's a particular way of organizing the components. Any change to that is a change for the worse. Or let me rephrase that. Any small change is a change for the worse. But there might be some large change where you completely alter all the components, you move some big cluster over to another part of the chip, and that might be a change for the better. But you'll never get there because you're looking for marginal improvements. Okay, so the random search doesn't work. The incremental improvements, the marginal improvement search, that's not great either. Well, what does work? Well, there are a whole class of algorithms. Actually, there are several classes of algorithms which basically start random and switch to marginal improvements over time. So the simplest one is called simulated annealing. And simulated annealing is basically a search for marginal improvements that at the beginning is like a drunken search for marginal improvements. So you just wander off, you do anything. It's an improvement, it's not an improvement, you're just trying random changes. But gradually, the algorithm moves more and more and more towards the search for marginal improvements. So you've got all that randomness at the beginning, that stops you getting stuck in a dead end, and then slowly, 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 you converge on a good solution. So you've got this straightforward problem-solving process, plus randomness at the beginning. Isn't that basically what Keith Jarrett was given? And he knows how to play the piano. He knows how to improvise for an hour. He's a genius. But rather than start with the traditional problem space, which is a perfect piano, every time, a perfect piano, you start with a bad piano, with all kinds of constraints, all kinds of things you can't do. Well, you've just been kicked into a totally different problem space. And it turns out when you start your search for perfection in that different place, you get somewhere new. And in this particular case, you got somewhere better. So there's a psychological element to this, that the creativity, the disruption inspires creativity, or the disruption forces you to pay attention. But there's also a purely logical element to this, that you can, in a complex problem space, add some randomness at the beginning, and you'll be able to find solutions more easily. I also promised I would talk about social psychology. So, well, what's social psychology? Social psychology is basically dealing with other people. And of course, there is nothing more frustrating and more distracting and no greater obstacle than coping with an awkward person, an awkward teammate, an awkward colleague. Other people are endlessly fascinating in this way. So, of course, there have been studies of this as well. Catherine Phillips, who's a psychologist at Northwestern University, and a couple of her colleagues, gave students a murder mystery problem-solving task. So they were given details of a apparent homicide. Here's the witness statements. Here's the DNA evidence. Here are 3 possible culprits. Read it all through and figure out who murdered the victim. And so this turns out to be quite a complicated problem. It's hard to do. If you give somebody all of this stuff and 20 minutes, they've only got about a 40% chance of getting it right. That's not great because it's a multiple choice. So if you guess at random, you've got 33%. So it's hard. It's hard. Give 4 people the problem and let them work on it together, and they improve. So they go up to about 50%. That's still not great. 50-50, 20 minutes, you got all the facts, you debate it with everybody, it's still hard to solve the problem. But the 4 people I'm describing trying to solve this problem, they're all friends. So that's one half of Catherine Phillips' experiment. 4 friends trying to solve this problem. The other half is 3 friends and a stranger trying to solve the problem. Now, of course, there are lots and lots of reasons why by adding a stranger to the mix, you might be able to solve problems more easily. So there's a great book by Scott Page called The Difference, which is, you got, I don't know, 3 psychologists in the room, and then the statistician comes in, and it's either a terrible joke with a bad punchline, or the statistician is able to tell the 3 psychologists something they didn't know. Or you've got the 3 accountants and the marketing person. Or you've got the 3 personal trainers and the nutrition expert. You've just got somebody who brings a different perspective. You know, the 3 English people and the French person. You know, they learn something from having the stranger in the room. But that's not what Catherine Phillips is studying here. Because the only information any of these people have is what's on the sheet of paper in front of them. So they've all got the same information. The stranger doesn't have any new information, doesn't have any new insight. And still, people are better at solving the problem. Much better at solving the problem, as it happens. Of a 75% success rate, up from 50% with 4 friends. And what's basically going on, it turns out, is the 3 friends get a lot less lazy. They want to look good in front of the stranger. They want to justify what they say. They want to explain all their reasoning. None of these shortcuts. Everyone is actually trying to explain things for the stranger, and in explaining things for the stranger, they're also explaining them for themselves. They do a much better job. But that's not what's really interesting about Catherine Phillips' research. What's really interesting about Catherine Phillips' research is how the research subjects felt about their experience. So you put the 4 friends in a group together, they will probably not solve the problem, but they will think they solved the problem. You ask them, you reckon you got your man? Yeah. Did you have a nice time? Oh, sure, yeah, we were chilling, had a great time. Good quality conversation? Oh, yeah, very good, very good. Go to the 3 friends and the stranger, and the answer to all 3 of those questions is different. You know, did you have a good time? No. Frankly, it was a bit awkward. Gooseberry in the corner of the room. Did you have a good quality of conversation? No, I don't think we did. Do you think you found the answer? No, we're not sure about that at all. But they did. And I think that's the challenge we're up against. It is not just that it's difficult to embrace the unplayable piano or the ugly font or the awkward stranger. It's the fact that even after we've done it, we still don't quite realize that it's helped us. We're still reluctant to embrace these obstacles in our lives. So far I've talked in quite sort of abstract terms. Is there any real-world evidence for this? Well, there's a classic example of the computational problem happened a couple of years ago when various stations on the London Underground were closed down. So there was a tube strike, shut down 2/3 of London Underground stations for 48 hours. And you would think nobody has their route to work better honed, right, than commuters. Okay, you go there every day, surely you have optimized that. Turns out not. So economists at Oxford University looking at data from Oyster cards, they're able to track everyone's progress through the system, through these smart cards they use when they swipe to go on the Underground. They were able to see, okay, this person took the same route to work, had about 20,000 people in the data set. This person took the same route to work every day for 2 weeks, and then the tube strike came, and then they took a different route. They took the bus, they took a different tube line, they took the train, we can track them. Okay, fine, they switched. We can see them switch. And then, the end of the strike, who switched back? And the answer is, well, most people switched back, 95% of people switched back, but 5% of people stuck with the same route they discovered during the strike. So you've got 1 in 20 people. This is quite a lot, really, because we're talking about commuters. 1 in 20 people were given this shock, and as a result of the shock, immediately discovered a better way of getting to work. They might have been doing that route for 20 years, and a tube strike points out that actually, if you walk to that tube station, it's a bit cheaper, more pleasant, easier, quicker, whatever, but they stuck with a new route. So that's just a simple example of this computational problem I was describing with the computer chips. You think you're optimizing, give it a knock sideways, give it a random element, and you're better able to solve the problem. What about the social psychology aspect? What about the working with the awkward strangers element? Well, there's a study by Angela Barnes and some colleagues of student friendship groups in University of Kansas and 4 much smaller private colleges near the University of Kansas. And what they found was the University of Kansas is huge. Okay, so you could be friends with anybody at the University of Kansas. You could be gay, straight, any ethnicity, any political background, any set of hobbies, whatever. There's a tremendous amount of diversity there, whereas the private colleges, they're smaller, and there's clearly, almost mathematically, there's less diversity there. But they studied the friendship groups of students at in these smaller or larger settings. And what they found was the students in the smaller colleges had the more diverse group of friends. It's like, I don't have a big choice of friends, so I've just got to make do with you guys. And so they formed these friendships. The students at the larger college were able to make friends with carbon copies of themselves. People who looked like themselves, dressed like themselves, thought like themselves, same ethnicity, same hobbies, same biases. And that made me think, because when I saw this work on the University of Kansas and how we avoid any interruption to our sort of smooth progress through the world, we avoid anybody who might disturb us by thinking differently at us. I thought, what about the internet? I mean, isn't the internet just one big University of Kansas? I realize no one's ever said that sentence before. So when you think about your phone, you get your phone out, and all of the people you could be connected to on the internet, all the places you could go, all the insights you could read. If you speak English, you could. If you don't speak English, I'm really sorry. It must have been a difficult 20 minutes. If you speak English, you could read the Times of India. It's an Indian newspaper written in English. You could read the Japan Times. You could read the news from Japan written in English. Language is no barrier. Any hobby group, any fetish group, any political group you want to read. But no, we read our favorite newspaper. The Conservatives watch Fox News, the Liberals watch MSNBC. We could meet anybody, see any view, have our thinking disturbed by any number of strange ideas, and we don't. We just stick to what we know and what we like, just like those students at the University of Kansas. Which is why I want to end by talking for a few minutes about rock and roll. Because rock and roll is where this all, the rubber hits the road, if I may use a terrible cliche. So for my book, which is coming out later this week, later this year, for my book I interviewed various people, and nobody excited me more than the musician Brian Eno. So he's the developer of ambient music. He was the sort of crazy glam rock wizard behind Roxy Music. He used to play the keyboard with a big plastic spoon and fork. He's this amazing producer. He blows like this zephyr of cerebral chaos across the frontal lobes of modern pop. So that something like the 100 best albums of the 1970s, according to one rating, Brian Eno was producing 25 of the 100 best albums. So he was just absolutely everywhere. He's worked with U2, he's worked with Paul Simon, he's worked with Devo and Laurie Anderson and Michael Nyman and Coldplay, and of course, he's worked with David Bowie. And so I talked to him about these great albums he did with David Bowie in Berlin. And when I was talking to Brian, I realized that this messy thing was something he really embraced. For example, that research about distractibility, Eno's incredibly distractible. So he says, it's a real problem for me. I cannot go to a restaurant where there's music playing and have a conversation at the same time. I just can't get my ears off the music. He needs to have these conversations in complete silence. That distractibility seems to be a help for him. Or when it comes to working with different people, clearly that's something Brian absolutely loves to do. Work with somebody new, gain a new insight. He says the enemy of creative work is boredom. And the friend of creative work is attention. And when something new is happening, somebody new, some new challenge, you pay intense attention. That's when it gets exciting. But most of all, Brian is associated with the idea that randomness can make you more creative. So when they got to these sort of tricky points in the Berlin albums, Brian would get out this deck of cards he called the oblique strategies. He'd produced them with a friend of his. And these are cards, you'd shuffle the cards, you draw one at random, and they've got these weird gnomic instructions on them, like, is it finished? Or everybody swap instruments. It's a brilliant idea. Put the guitarist on the drums. And this is what they were doing while they made Low, and while they made Heroes, and while they made Iggy Pop's The Idiot, drawing these random instructions from the cards. And the thing is, the musicians hated them. They hated them. So Another Green World, Brian Eno album, Prince said it was his favourite album of all time. Phil Collins plays on that album. During the recording of that album, Phil Collins was throwing beer cans across the studio at Brian because he was so annoyed with what Eno kept asking him to do. Or Carlos Alomar, great jazz guitarist. It was said Carlos had a real problem with Brian Eno because Carlos is a professional and he doesn't want to play stuff that sounds like crap. There was another recording session where Carlos Alomar, one of the greatest guitarists in the world, is put on the drums. He's told to play the drums, and then Adrian Belew comes in, another great guitarist. He's not heard any of the music, and he looks, he's like, why is Carlos on the drums? And they say, oh, don't worry, plug the guitar in, the music will, Carlos will go 1, 2, 3, and then you play. He's like, play what? What key? Don't worry about the key, just play. And so Adrian plays this guitar solo, and it's spliced together and it becomes the solo from Boys Keep Swinging. It's regarded as one of the most amazing gonzo guitar solos in history, produced from this process of pure mess, pure disruption. And in the end, they realized Brian Eno was right. So Carlos Alomar, who said at the time that he didn't want to play crap, later said, it took me to a different place. And to be honest, I did not like that place. But when I came back, I was fresh. Maybe there was something in it. And he now teaches guitar, teaches music, and he uses the oblique strategies to teach his students, because he says, I want them to understand how I felt on stage. Originally, the oblique strategies weren't a deck of cards. They were just a list, reminders of things to do in the studio. And Eno abandoned that idea. It didn't work. You know why? List is too orderly. It's too predictable. Your eye would go down the list, would pick out the precise thing that was going to cause you the least trouble. And that's why it didn't work. Because we're always going to react like Keith Jarrett. Now, we're never going to want to deal with the awkward stranger or read the ugly font or draw a random card. But we need to. And whatever it takes to get us to do that, whether it's a deck of cards or whether it's a guilt trip from a German teenager, we all need to be willing, from time to time, to play the unplayable piano. Thank you very much for listening.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much, Tim. We've got 2 questions. I mean, so I'm just seeing anybody. I'll give you a bit of time to think of one, because that's a mind-blowing and fantastic talk. It's a little similar to, I know Nassim Taleb talks a little bit about, the fact that he actually believes that in evolutionary terms, having constant preferences would be a disadvantage. There are cases in nature where, for example, 20% of bees ignore the waggle dance. That if you don't actually inject a degree of randomness into your life, apart from that, you never get lucky. Yeah. I think the problem is, it won't be a whole disaster, but actually you require, and that tube example is absolutely perfect. So these people probably had been making the journey for 15 years, convinced that it was optimal. The 5% discovered that actually, the tube station that was a little bit further away had a nicer coffee shop that had opened since they'd... So Nassim would argue that actually the idea of constant or even transitive preferences being optimal is a ridiculous assumption. He also has, I think, the idea of stochastic resonance is a similar thing where, weirdly, if you have a weak signal, adding a background of random noise adds to the strength of the signal for some strange reason. Which is why working in coffee shops is better than working in silence, perhaps. I don't know.
Perhaps so. So there are a couple of things going on. There is this idea that you're searching a solution space, and the randomness gets you to a better solution, as with Keith Jarrett, as with the tube stations. But there's also a case of if you don't have randomness, your processes might end up converging on something that is very, very well optimized. But when the world changes, then you're in trouble.
So that's the problem with the bees, if they all obeyed the waggle dance.
So it's partly about, I want to be more creative, but it's also about, I want to be more resilient. And the mess, having to deal with the mess, can also make you more resilient.
So perfect, and of course, the other great thing about knowing, I mean, funnily enough, learning from that tube station example, when my brother moved out of London, I told him the question to ask everybody when you move out of London isn't how long does it take to get to work, because everybody will give you the best case scenario. So what's the second best way of getting to work? Because the first best route will always fail at some point. So at that point, you have a plan B if you've just experimented. So, I mean, I don't know if you're here for Isabel's talk, but I mean, her view would be that humour and play are there as a kind of randomness generator.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a line of thinking on playgrounds that they should be messy, because that generates freer play, that generates generates play behavior that is more likely to actually help you in the world. Once your playground is all rubberized and all the steps are perfectly even, you're actually not really learning anything about the real world, and you're not playing in a creative way.
No, because I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I have a theory that the only value of advertising agencies isn't really that they produce advertising. The real value is you create a working culture where you can make really stupid suggestions and still get promoted. Because one of the things you notice, if you go into a more serious environment, basically the price of saying anything silly is kind of career-threatening. And so there is that fundamental risk, which is that people become highly conformist, particularly within a peer group, which I think is interesting, and that effectively what happens is you become massively blinkered as a result.
Yeah. So, and the people who make those silly suggestions, they're a source of noise. They're probably improving the quality of the discussion, no end. Even if the suggestion is actually is objectively a bad suggestion, it might well elicit better suggestions from other people.
Excellent. So we must have two questions by now. I gave you time. That gentleman there, is it? Lady? I can't see, because I've got bright lights. Gentleman there, actually, yeah.
Thank you. I'm a master's student, and I'm working now in my dissertation about nudge awareness. I think most of all knows what this refers. But hearing your talk, Tim, I wonder if this messy description that you make also needs one agent to push someone into that mess for this to work, or if it doesn't matter if I myself, knowing this idea, I can push myself into that mess into work.
It's a good question. Do you need a provocateur? So Jarrett needed Vera Brandes. Even this great improviser, he still needed Vera Brandes and her situation to embrace the mess. Eno said he felt that was his role. So he was often not the producer. He was often just some other guy. So you've got a band. You've got the producer working for the record company who wants to produce something very similar to the previous album. And they're tight on studio time and so on. So the band, therefore, feel the producer is not necessarily, is sort of working with them, but sort of working for the record company against them. You've got Eno comes in, and then he actually sort of, there's no risk to him, and therefore he's able to be more disruptive. He's able to do things the band wouldn't be willing to do that might then be in the long-term interest of the band, because they can't take that risk, but he can. So they bring him in to mess things up for them, because they can't do it themselves.
And it's easier for him to do that not under the producer mantle, perhaps.
Yeah. He's got creative, he's the advertising executive in the room. He's got the creative freedom. He can say what he likes. No consequence for him. If the album's a flop, he's on to the next album. So he's actually less risk averse. And it's because he's less risk averse. I mean, obviously many other things about him.
Yeah.
But that's one of the attractions to the band.
That's absolutely fair. Next question. Gentleman there. Brian, isn't it? Yes. There are.
Hi, Tim. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, you quoted, and there was a certain amount of self-consciousness when you said that, Harvard students are the most studied group in the world. And this, maybe this has contributed to what seems to be a reproducibility crisis in psychology at the moment. There was a big paper last year in Science which said that only 39% of the psychological tests of the kinds that you are quoting could be reproduced, and there was one of the other, I think it was Nature, said it might be as high as 80%. So, A, are you comfortable with this being called science at all? And B, is this actually just another massive confirmation bias of psychologists and marketers loving each other and, sort of ignoring what is increasingly an elephant in the room, which is that this stuff might not be true?
Yeah, I think we need to be a lot more rigorous about reproducibility. I actually have a piece in the Financial Times tomorrow. I saw they've given it the headline, The Problem with Power Poses, and they had framed it as basically me taking on Amy Cuddy, which I'm not particularly happy about, but there you go, we don't write our own headlines. Amy Cuddy's work is the example that I chose of just a very famous piece of work. So this is kind of like if you have adopt a pose like this for 2 minutes, or some other powerful pose like this. It changes your hormone levels, and it boosts testosterone and reduces cortisol. And that might be true, but when the experiment was repeated with a larger sample and the slight differences, the effect goes away. Now, all I would say is we shouldn't have a status quo bias. So we shouldn't now think because Amy's work came first, that's the truth that then needs to be disproved with a huge burden of proof. We should view the attempt to reproduce the research on the same basis as the original research. So imagine, Andrew Gelman, the statistician, says this. So imagine the first study came first, it's larger, finds no effect, then we have the smaller study comes along and does find an effect. Or do you think, well, there probably isn't an effect, but there might be, and let's keep studying it. A lot of the stuff that we say has failed to reproduce, often you've got a situation where you found the same effect, but not with statistical significance, so there's more noise. So if I assume a particular effect is, say, as a 20% increase, and then someone comes along and does the same study and also finds a 20% increase, but with a lot of noise, they will not achieve statistical significance. So have they failed to reproduce the study, or have they supported the study? We still don't have, we need a Bayesian approach to this. We still don't have the right tools for thinking about this. But I'm very happy that we're starting to take this stuff more seriously.
By the way, I don't want to go into a whole a debate which is about 60 or 70 years old, but you could argue it's a crisis for academics who have this arbitrary measure of statistical significance. Seeley Gossett, the man who came up with the student's t-distribution, always regarded Fisher's choice of 0.05 as arbitrary, because he said the level of certainty you should require should depend on the consequences of the decision you make based on the information. Okay? Now, let's take an example of a study that doesn't fully replicate, which is...
by the way, and we know where Gossett worked. He worked with Guinness.
Exactly.
He made beer. He was interested in business problems.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So,
whereas Fisher, brilliant though he was a statistician. So the interesting question there, you see, I would argue, if you take the JAM study, okay, the paradox of choice JAM study, okay, it doesn't always replicate, but it gives you enough evidence to believe that the assumption that more choice will always mean more consumer utility may not be true. And at Ogilvy Change, we actually applied that to an airline sale where we didn't list all 29 destinations, we listed 5, and the thing was massively successful. So if actually you can test that, if it just encourages people to test things with a relatively small cost, which are counterintuitive, to be honest, the degree of absolute statistical robustness required should be less. But anyway, more on that later. There is a fair point about that. The other person, Deirdre McCloskey, is very good on criticising this whole approach, if you want a bit of extra stuff. Next, we'll have one more question, I think, because it's... Nobody?
Or we won't.
Yes, there is. Ah, fantastic. Lee, I thought there would be.
Be very brief.
Yeah, it will be very brief questions. Otherwise... Oh, by the way, would you argue that Brexit... Would you argue that Brexit would be a healthy disruption to the system?
I guess we'll find out. I guess I feel a little bit like I feel a little bit like Keith Jarrett did when faced with the unplayable piano. There's no way this is going to work. And usually it doesn't, but sometimes it does.
Sometimes it does. Okay, very good answer. Okay, right, Lee, sorry, very quickly.
Are there rules for designing the best approach to messiness? Presumably not just any kind of randomness will increase productivity or will increase performance. Are there ways to design it so that you're more likely to get good results?
I think it depends on the structure of the problem. So if you're looking at, say, a computational problem like logistics or packing transistors onto silicon chips, we have a good sense of which algorithms work and which don't. And actually which algorithms work and which don't is above my pay grade. But we've got, we have a sense of that because we understand the structure of the problem. We're able to run it again and again. I think more broadly, I think it's hard to say exactly when randomness is going to help and when it isn't. But as a rule of thumb, there's the explore-exploit trade-off. So if some kind of breakthrough, if it's the last week of your working life, experimenting with different ways to commute, there's no upside to this. But if it's the first month you're in a new city, you should probably be trying all kinds of things that probably won't work. Because even if one of them does work, you've got the rest of your time in that city.
So humans actually manifest that. The young are more experimental than the old. I mean, if you ask me where you want to go on holiday, I'll go to the same place I went last year. Yeah. But I have a reasonable bedrock of experience, whereas if 18-year-olds did that, it would be patently silly.
Absolutely, yeah. You know more, but you'll be alive for less time. Rory.
Yes, exactly.
So
there's less of a payback. Less of a payback for me discovering something new and fantastic. That's very, very interesting.
But my rule of thumb is, which is what I argue in the book, is that we tend to be biased towards not enough disruption, not enough mess. So wherever you are, try a little bit more and see how it works out.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You'll be here for dinner, will you?
I won't.
Okay, well, we'll catch up soon. Thank you. I'll just